for Henry Lesser, we would not know about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as Panzram goes, obviously you've read up on him, the subject matter, but can you kind of talk about, he made a lot of claims, and I'm curious how much of it you think were actually true as opposed to things that he was just, because these serial killers, a lot of times you can't believe what they say because they're either fluffing, I guess stats is what they call it, but you know what I mean, the amount of people they've killed, raped in this situation and everything else.
I'll give you a call back. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
I think I lost you, so I'm going to call you back.
Okay, feel free. Vic, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, just making sure you can hear me okay, right?
Yep, I could hear both of you, but he said that his phone might drop, so maybe he just couldn't hear us on the other line, on his line.
I think probably because he's driving around or something like that. Because different. I think he's West Coast, so a little different timing for him there.
Yep.
And if anybody else does get on the line, again, I'm not sure about Borowski, and I'm not sure about other people, although I expect maybe at least one more person to call in. Feel free to just, interrupt me or just cut in at an opportune time. We'll pull them in and, we'll round table this thing. But in the meantime, Joel Goodman's just been a wealth of knowledge already because, what's it take to get into the prison career? And then from there, you find people that you find fascinating. And for people who've seen this documentary, prison life played a huge part in what Carl Panzram became, in my opinion.
Hey,
I think that's pretty much back. Go ahead.
All right, we got Mr. Goodman back on the line.
Well,
my apologies,
sorry.
Joel. I guess no worries at all. No worries. I could hear you, but I guess you were having a hard time hearing me. But you're back on, and what I touched on before you dropped there was I was wondering, like your opinion, and of course it's never going to be known, but what you think Carl Panzram, the things he confessed to versus what he actually did. What do you believe is kind of the true number there of the murders and things like that? Or do you think he was just, kind of trying to make himself more notorious than maybe what he actually was?
I have a different perspective on this than John Borowski, and I have great admiration and respect for John because he immersed himself in this and he created a wonderful must-see film with timeless lessons. And John is of the opinion that Panzram may have embellished some of his claims about the number of murders, the number of rapes, the number of robberies, whatever it may be. My position is a little bit different. I have no reason to believe that Panzram manufactured anything about what he wrote in his manuscript. And the reason I say that is because I read the Bureau of Prisons reports and the FBI investigation of the murder he did of the laundry foreman at the U.S. Penitentiary in Leavenworth. His name was R.G. Warnke. And the manner in which he carried out this murder was calculated, and it was done in such a that tells me that he was not new to taking someone's life. And the other thing that suggests to me that he was truthful was because he had this relationship with Henry Lesser. And he had nothing to gain by manufacturing any of this. And I believe he had a need to get this story out, and Henry was the conduit. And there's nothing for him to gain by lying about it. The other thing that also suggests to me about Panzram's credibility was in some of his earlier arrest records. He was very candid when he was asked about, what do you do for a living? He replied, thief. So here's a guy who tells it like it is.
Now, some of his stories of the road and of, the kind of the drifter part of Carl Panzram are pretty well known, but do you think he would have become what he became? Now, obviously, he wasn't such a good guy anyway, but do you think he would have become what he became if it wasn't for his treatment in prison? Because obviously, you know, there was a little bit of mistreatment back in those days in U.S. prisons.
I believe he's a natural product of those brutal environments. And with him, it started as a very young kid when he was locked up in a reformatory in Red Wing, Minnesota. And, you know, here's a situation where they're trying to teach you to have love of God, and they're beating that into you. It just doesn't work. And Panzram was clear about this. After he murdered Warnke, he wrote in a letter that, you know, I just took a man's life and I'm being treated very well, I'm being fed very well, and I'm not being beaten or abused. And he made the statement that had I received this kind of treatment early on, perhaps there wouldn't have been the destruction that I caused.
So, is there a connection between Panzram and prison reform that you're aware of?
Is there a connection?
Yeah. I mean, were there anybody that kind of put his stories under a microscope and were like, you know, our prisons are absolutely horrible, or was it some other incidents that really kind of pushed that forward, you know, in the 20th century?
I would like to, I wish I could say that there is a correlation between Panzram's story becoming public and some meaningful changes that have happened within the prison systems and the jail systems in the United States. I'm not seeing any evidence of it. The only type of direct impact is when a case gets elevated up to federal court and a court renders a over-the-top judgment against a jail or a prison for conduct that is a violation of the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. That will usually get the attention of a prison administration, and they'll be either motivated or forced to make some meaningful changes. But absent that, there's a very dysfunctional and it's a dysfunctional culture in many agencies, not all, but many agencies that allow this abuse to take place hidden from public view. And I wish I could tell you that in 2015 that this is all history, but it's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's probably true of a lot of things, unfortunately. But you know, to kind of go back to Panzram himself, can you? And again, I'm asking you to play kind of a therapist for somebody who's no longer around. But you know, based on your research, curious what it is about him that kind of separates him from your average serial killer who usually takes out their aggression on women, whereas, you know, his victims were male. What was it about him? Was it the prison thing? You know, was it life on the road? What was that kind of gave him the hatred towards males more so than females, obviously?
Well, when Henry was interviewed by myself and two San Diego State professors, Ron Boostrom and Tom Gitchoff, in 1979, he made one of his responses to our questions was Panzram was homosexual. So that may explain why he would gravitate towards being around men as opposed to women. And but he also described Panzram as treating a sick inmate very in a tender manner. So the guy had some humility, and but he was also a monster, and he had this evil streak within him that was out of control.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think he was also a product of the time? Because at the time, things were still a little bit of the wild, wild west mentality in our country. It hadn't quite become that civilized in the 20th century quite yet.
You're absolutely right. But the other thing that strikes me about Panzram from seeing his writings, the guy, even though he didn't have an education, he was very articulate, very insightful, and he had plenty to say in his manuscript.
Let me ask you this. Do you think him being the product of his time, or him existing in the time that he did, is that one of the reasons that Panzram, for better or for worse, is one of the lesser known, I guess, mass murderers or serial killers in our history? Because people talk about all of the recent ones, but they forget about people like H.H. Holmes or Carl Panzram when they really start talking about these guys who were prolific monsters.
Well, the interesting thing about the Panzram story, he was one of the first known serial killers. You've got H.H. Holmes, who occurred before, and he was of a different ilk. The interesting thing about the Panzram story was Henry Lesser being able to reach him and connect with him and encouraged him to write his story. And so, you can view, there's two stories within this. You've got Carl Panzram, the very bright monster, and then you've got Henry Lesser, who is this conscientious person who wants to better the system. And the two of them connected.
So I'm looking for parallels here between this and what you went through in 31 years. Was there ever anybody that kind of reminded you, or that you had that type of relationship with, where it was like, they did all these horrible things on the outside or even on the inside, but because you treated them well, they treated you with respect as well?
That happened with a number of prisoners that I knew in the federal system. I used to be able to get along with the worst of the population very easily. The people who were first-time offenders, I didn't have a whole lot in common with them. I didn't really speak their language. But the people who had been around for a long time were pretty sophisticated. I could connect with them quite well. And I never would take advantage of them. And I was treated very well by them. They never got anything extra from me, and they knew that I couldn't be compromised. So when you treat them with respect, you typically get it back.
Now, and again, you don't have to name names or anything like this, but, as far as people you worked with, were you getting the vibe that everybody else was on that same page, or were they kind of, a few of them going rogue and thinking that they had their own way of doing things and then obviously not working it out as well for them?
I'm sorry to tell you that I've seen a number of fellow officers who've been marched out of the institutions by FBI agents in handcuffs for bringing in contraband and dealing in drugs. One officer I worked with was sentenced to prison for participating in an escape. I mean, these ugly things take place in the profession, and I saw it firsthand.
And I guess, again, for a Panzram connection, and obviously we're not talking torture or anything, but you never know. Did you ever witness any of these people that worked at the prisons kind of mistreating the prisoners? I mean, like truly, truly mistreating them?
Not in the federal system. The federal system is it's not perfect by any means, but it's the best of all the systems. And that kind of abuse would be treated, or that kind of overt abuse would be treated very swiftly and severely. There may be subtle things that take place, but overt abuse like the stuff that Panzram had in his life. That doesn't go on today in the federal system.
Now, in doing various types of research